Hi, welcome to this episode of the First Trust ROI podcast. I'm Ryan Isakainen, ETF strategist at First Trust. In this episode, I'm joined by Jim Murchie, co-founder and co-portfolio manager at Energy Income Partners. Energy Income Partners has sub-advised several investment funds at First Trust for many years, starting in 2012, I believe. They manage a few different ETFs as sub-advisor, as well as a number of closed-end funds. Jim has a wide range of knowledge and expertise when it comes to the energy sector, the utility sector. We're also going to discuss alternative energy, how that impacts the overall energy ecosystem. I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation with Jim. I hope you enjoyed as well on this episode of the First Trust ROI podcast. Jim, thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast. It took a while to arrange all the details in our schedules. Logistics, exactly. Great to finally sync up with you. And you're an expert, at least from my perspective. I don't know anybody else that's more expert on the energy industry as well as the utility, that whole ecosystem. And, we met maybe a decade or a little bit more ago when we launched our first fund where your firm, Energy Income Partners, is sub-advising. And one of the things that became clear to me is that there are a lot of things that analysts take for granted when it comes to investing in energy, when it comes to investing in utilities. So let me start off by asking you, when you think about what people tend to miss, particularly with energy companies, maybe some of the producers, what's the biggest thing that analysts or just normal investors tend to miss?
Yeah, it is a difference between the analyst and the portfolio managers, because the analysts live and breathe this stuff. They spend their time talking to the company managers. They have spreadsheets that basically allow them to reverse engineer the company's earnings forecasts. But then you have the portfolio managers that have to cover all of the industries, and no one has the ability to know the detail. And so they then have an idea of how to invest across different sectors, and every sector has a few quirks about it, right, that you kind of have to know. And the thing with oil and gas that I think trips people up is that it's not a factory. It's not a machine that cranks out widgets so long as you keep it staffed and oiled and maintained. It is a natural reservoir in the ground that you're draining as fast as you can without damaging the rock. And so people look at valuations very often of oil and gas companies. It's 3 or 4 times EBITDA. I think it's cheap. And it's like, well, yeah, a lot of that EBITDA has to go back into the ground just to hold production flat. And so what a lot of folks don't get is that on a global basis, if we stop drilling today, by this time next year, the world would be producing between 6 and 8% less oil and gas. So that's the range of what people sort of say is the natural decline rate. And so so when people think about the energy transition and they think, okay, we're going to start chipping into oil and gas's market share, it's going to lower the price. That's not the case. So if you have, for example, a 6 to 8% decline rate, demand's only growing 1 to 2%. So 3/4 of the dollars the industry is spending is just replacing the decline. So if oil demand went to zero, you would still have to spend money to replace the decline. And the industry is not going to do that unless they get a price for oil and gas that gives them a return on that investment. So therefore the price setting mechanism isn't going to change whether oil demand is growing 1% a year or shrinking 1% a year. The math is essentially the same because the bulk of the dollars they're spending is simply offsetting that decline.
So that, I think, has some implications when I think about all the different policymakers and regulators and market participants that are all kind of jockeying to have their own views. Let's take a step back and when it comes to regulation and the policymakers, whether at the state level or the federal level, do you think that they understand that dynamic that you're talking about, where you've got a wasting asset and it requires investment to just maintain production? Is that something that's well understood?
No, I don't think so. So folks, want people that want carbon and methane emissions to go away because of their impact on the temperature of the planet They simply want the fossil fuel industry to go away. And so they have taken sort of a war on drugs approach.
Okay.
Remember, the war on drugs has been going on for now like 6 decades. We've made no progress because we're not really addressing the demand side. We're addressing the supply side, right? So think about all the things that creates. And if you try to do that with a fossil, you're going to get the exact same result. So you can get, for example, the oil companies in the OECD to maybe spend less money. But if the world is demanding oil and gas, there's going to be a price at which you can make a profit drilling for it. So someone else will pull it out of the ground. And so the idea, and we've had some, whether it's the International Energy Agency or other people saying, no more new projects, no more new drilling for oil and gas. So like, well, no drilling means a 6 to 8% decline. It doesn't mean flat.
Right.
And so if you were to have policies to stop drilling, you would see the world basically, you would see the world economy shrink by a comparable amount because you need energy to run the economy.
And it seems to me that you probably need that energy if you want to put installations of, renewable energy, solar panels, wind farms. You have to actually operate heavy machinery to do some of those things, to make the factories that produce the solar photovoltaic.
Photovoltaic. Yeah. But that's so another misperception now when you get to the policy side. And we saw a lot of this in the financial press around COVID when oil and gas demand fell. Well, the oil and gas demand fell because everyone was staying home. They weren't, there was a distinct drop in human activity. Was that this drop? Yeah, some of it was COVID, but it's the beginning of renewables chewing into oil's market share. Well, the reason that can't be true is because wind and solar are used to make electricity, and only 4% of oil demand is for electricity. So the two have almost nothing to do with each other.
4%. I think that's a much smaller figure than most people realize.
Yeah.
Just 4%.
4%. And so if you look at natural gas, it's somewhere between 30 and 40%. And this is on a global basis, not just the US. 30 to 40% of natural gas demand is to make electricity. For coal, the number is something like 80%, but a significant portion of coal is used to make steel. So it's the high quality metallurgical coal, and you cook the coal down for pure carbon, and that's what goes into a blast furnace. But this confusion about renewables and oil really hinges on people not really knowing what the pie chart of demand for oil is. And the biggest slice of that demand pie is transportation. It's nearly 50%. And so the threat to oil demand isn't wind and solar, it's electrification of transportation. And that's that. Now you get to the next misunderstanding, which is the rate at which the transportation system is electrifying. So everyone sees statistics about the percentage of new car sales that are electric.
Right.
Well, new car sales are only about 7% globally of the entire on-road fleet, which is over 1.2 billion vehicles. And so you say, well, so 7%, so, the fleet turns over every 15 years. No. 3 of those 7 percentage points is because the fleet is expanding. The world economy is growing. We're putting more cars on the road every year, about 2 to 3% a year. 4% is replacing scrappage. Okay, so the average life of a vehicle on the road is 25 years.
Right.
So that means you're only scrapping 4%. So if starting tomorrow, 100% of every passenger vehicle sold on this planet was electric, it would take 25 years for those to work their way through the on-road passenger fleet. But passenger cars are only half of the 50% of oil demand that's transportation. So over 25 years, let's say you got rid of 25% of oil demand. Well, the other 3/4 of oil demand is still growing, and the two would roughly offset each other. That's why it's so hard to chew into the amount of oil the world demands every year.
And as the economy grows, of course, you need to transport things, you need to move things around, and
it's a moving target.
I think that realization that There's not a fungibility between wind and solar, and oil
Right.
is something that people really
They
misunderstand.
miss that. Yeah, there is on gas, but also there is on coal. And so when you do the energy balance and you say what you said, the world economy is going to grow. I mean, historically, about 3% a year. And the ratio of that growth rate to oil growth rate has been declining pretty much ever since World War II. I mean, when you came out of World War II, oil demand grew faster than GDP because we were reindustrializing the world. Well, that number is now about 0.5. So if you have 3% GDP growth, you're only going to have 1.5% growth in primary energy. That's coal, natural gas, nuclear, oil, wind, solar, the raw BTUs or calories, however you want to think about raw primary energy. And so if over, you do your forecast 10 years out, 15 years out, you need more energy. And you say, okay, how am I going to get it? And you say, well, let's let renewables grow 15% a year. And you say, what about hydro? Well, we've kind of already dammed the big rivers in the world. It's only growing about 1% a year. Nuclear is kind of flat because the new plants are offsetting the ones that are closing. And now you're left with filling the void with coal and natural gas. Because you can grow renewables 15% a year, you're still not offsetting the need for either coal or natural gas. It's just not. The 15% is a high growth rate. It's just on such a small base that until you get 20 years out, it's very difficult to see a decline. So you can, combine sort of coal and natural gas to make electricity. And, maybe coal grows, gas shrinks. I don't know. I think it's more likely that coal shrinks and gas grows. That's what's been happening in the OECD. And it's very difficult to come up with a forecast where natural gas isn't growing 2% a year for the next 10 years.
So do you think that I'm asking you to sort of project forward a long time, and that's always difficult because new technologies come out, new innovations, new efficiencies. But do you think that over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years that there will be this continued significant transition to renewables? And maybe what are some of the hindrances that could prevent that from happening? Because I know that's what policymakers say they want to see happen.
Yeah, the wind and solar.
Net zero.
See, wind and solar, you can understand the attractiveness of it because without subsidies in places where it's windy and sunny, it actually is the low-cost form of new electricity. What slows it down is its lack of density. And so there's a great story. Michael Schellenberger, who ran for governor in California, is an old 60s radical, wrote a book called, I think it's called Apocalypse Never. And he tells this great story about the one remaining nuclear power plant that we have in California, Diablo Canyon. And he goes all the way back in time to I think it was the 1960s, where Pacific Gas and Electric was gathering public support for this power plant. And they went to the Sierra Club, which at the time was barely becoming an advocacy group. It really was a club of people that enjoyed nature. And on the board was none other than Ansel Adams. And so they kind of studied it and they came back to Pacific Gas and Electric and they say, no, we like this plant because of its energy density. It has a very small footprint, very small disturbance. We understand it has to be on the water because of the water cooling, but we would actually ask you, if you're going to add nuclear power plants, to put them all on the same footprint so we don't have these things dotting the California coast 20 years from now. So the Sierra Club advocated for this plant because of its energy density. When you look at the friction against wind and solar, especially wind, it's the fact that it takes up an enormous footprint. And so in places like Iowa, you have counties putting in restrictions on setbacks. So you think of setbacks as a zoning restriction, right? Your house has to be 10 or 20 feet back from the property line. Well, the states and the counties have the right to do zoning. And if these folks in that county don't want windmills, they'll put in a setback requirement of 2,500 feet. Well, Iowa is laid out on 1 mile squares, 5,280 feet. If you have a 2,500 foot setback, that leaves you one 280 square foot pad in the middle of that square mile to put a windmill, which is uneconomic. And so that lack of density is its biggest problem. So now that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has passed and all the subsidies are in place, and these folks are now trying to put this money to work, they are running into the local opposition that comes with an energy source that's not dense.
So we talk about the NIMBYism, the not in my backyard.
Yeah.
Do you think? I mean, is that what's happening in places like Iowa and also off the in the New England offshore space and
yeah, it's happening. It's happening down the Midwest. I mean, actually, I believe Illinois actually tried to pass a state law to prevent localities from doing that. So remember this. So those powers emanate from the state. A town has zoning ability because it's granted to that town in the town's charter, but it all emanates from the state. And so that is what's happening in places where wind is going in. And when you look at the forecasts going forward, there is actually more solar than wind going forward. In the last 10 years, it was the opposite. Part of that was economics. Wind achieved sort of economic competitiveness before solar. What's going on in New England is just cost overruns. So it is much more expensive to put a windmill in the ocean than it is on land. So even without subsidies, there are places sort of down the middle of the US, which is where our wind corridor is, where for 3 cents a kilowatt hour, you can put in a wind farm and get a 10% cash on cash return. And to put that into context, the average wholesale price of electricity in the United States is 5 cents. The average retail price is 12. So it costs 7 cents, if you will, to take it to your house. It costs 5 cents to kind of generate it. So if you can name that tune for anything less than 5 cents, you have an economic project. The offshore wind in New England, you can understand why they did it. New England is short of energy, and they have decided they don't want any more natural gas. So new gas pipelines, and even expansion of an existing pipeline is clearly not an option. And they are now, I believe, on their fourth option of trying to run a transmission wire up into Ontario to access hydropower. And they have a hard time getting that done. It's still not built yet. So you say, okay, one of the strongest wind resources in the lower 48 is offshore, in particularly the Northeast. And in the Northeast, the water's shallow. So it costs less money to put the windmill in. So it's like, okay, if we're going to do it, this makes it, you're going to do it here. But the numbers were coming in 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And you say, well, that's not great. Wholesale prices of electricity in New England are a little bit more expensive than the rest of the country. Call it 7 cents. So 8 to 10 is not that far out. We have COVID, supply chain stuff's coming in at 15 cents. So that was politically beyond sort of the level at which the governors felt they could support it. The people who developed the wind said, I can't eat these costs. I would rather pay the penalty to cancel the project, which they all had the ability to do, than go forward with the project. And some of these companies wrote off billions of dollars on these projects. So now they're going through rebidding, but the numbers will come in higher than they were.
Is that maybe it's a combination, but is it more to blame just general inflation, the materials and things like this, or is it financing costs because rates have moved up?
It was both. It was both. So think about capital intensity being, what portion of your costs are labor versus capital. And so, if you're a coal plant, a lot of it's labor. It takes a lot of people to run around and move that coal and operate, what is a fairly old technology. A windmill sits there and spins.
Right.
So it's virtually 100% capital. So your cost of financing has a lot to do with the cost that people are going to pay for electricity coming from that device. So what's interesting about when people talk about policy, it's easy as a government to advocate wind and solar that is cheaper than wind and solar that's more expensive. And then now you get to the part of the equation that is really confusing to people, and that is the fact that there is a cost to back up the intermittency of wind and solar, and who pays for it. Because when you look at those total costs, they may not, in fact, be cheaper. But the developer, the person, a renewable developer is a company that, say, buys the wind turbines, acquires the land, hires the construction company, and does a 20 to 25-year contract with a utility. So they're getting basically a fixed price over the course. So it's almost like a utility kind of return. And the utility says, let's say they pay whatever it is, 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Their alternatives are 5. You say, this is great, until you have so much of this that someone says, wait a minute, the system needs some other source of reliable energy. The industry calls it dispatchable, meaning you can dispatch it pretty much at the turn of a switch. And the question is, who pays for that? And the answer is the state-regulated utilities. So the people that operate the poles and wires, and in some states they're allowed to operate power generation, they're they have what's known as an obligation to serve. And think about it politically. Everybody knows who their utility is. They write a check to them every month. No one knows who the regional transmission organization is. No one knows who the wind developer is, but they know the name of the governor and they know the name of their utility. So when the lights go out, that's who they're going to blame.
That's who I blame when my lights go out.
And they're the only people with a direct sort of source of financing. So, our model in the world of energy in this country is that basically all the electricity and all the natural gas is delivered to the customer through a regulated monopoly utility. And we set that up so there wouldn't have 3 sets of poles and wires running down your street. We tried that with railroads, and it was a financial disaster in the 1800s. So when we got to the early 1900s, we said there's a better way. Let's have a monopoly. But if you give someone a monopoly, you got to restrict what they're allowed to earn on their invested capital, and they have to be able to serve everybody. You can't say no shirt, no shoes, no service, because you're the only business in that footprint. And so when we deregulated the electric power part of the business and made that a merchant business, so think of a wind farm or a solar farm as being a merchant business. Yeah, it's a long-term contract, but they're making a profit on the difference between what they sell the electricity for and what it costs. A utility is a cost plus arrangement, right? They look at all their operating costs, the interest on debt.
Hold on, before you, because this is something that most people don't understand.
Yeah, so people in policy don't understand this stuff.
Just take a step back. A cost plus business is not usually how a business operates.
No.
So break down that difference for me.
Yeah, so a typical business, right? If you can sell something for more than it costs, you get a profit.
Right.
But when you set up a monopoly, you've sort of taken the market mechanism away, right? There is no competition. And you say, well, why would you do that? And you say, well, we're going to do it so that we don't waste society's capital and have 3 sets of poles and wires running down every street. We tried that with railroads. It was a financial disaster. And so we have this regulated monopoly model for water, sewer, natural gas, and electricity. And that's how we deliver things. So in the world of water and sewer, the vast majority, over 85% of those assets are owned by municipalities and counties. They're not investor-owned utilities. In energy, we went the other way, where 75 to 80 is, in fact, owned by investors. So the investors provide the capital, and they get what's known as an allowed rate of return on their invested equity. So when the utility decides what to charge, they sit with their public utility commission and they say, our operating costs are X, interest on debt is Y. We're allowed a 10% return on equity, that's Z. We're going to add all those up, and that's our revenue requirement. We're going to divide that by the kilowatt hours, and that's what everyone's going to pay. And so it is certainly better than having a bunch of bankrupt, overly built poles and wires companies. I think it's also better than having the municipalities do it because their access to capital is limited. Everything is debt for them, and they need approval to issue the debt. So it's a great model, but you have to make sure that the companies are doing what you want them to do. Once you give someone an allowed rate of return, they don't hear allowed, they hear guaranteed. So now they're levering up too much. Or they say, you know what? If I grow my investment base and you give me an allowed rate of return on it, I can grow earnings per share for my shareholders. So I haven't met a utility CEO that doesn't want to grow rate base as fast as he or she can to keep their shareholders happy. And so this is a great system of bringing capital into the energy system that operates under the supervision of a state regulator. And there's this great comment from someone at one of the biggest energy buyers of the United States. And I was at a kind of an environmental conference, and the person shared with the group a comment from an electric utility CEO. He said to this buyer, he says, every time you basically backstop with your contracts, a new wind and solar farm is another natural gas plant I got to put on the grid to back it up. And so that's the dynamic we have today that people don't quite get because we have this hybrid system. And so the merchant power guys are all about making a profit. And if they can make a profit from selling electricity for more than it costs, they're allowed to deliver electrons to the grid. There is no reliability requirement. any more than there is for delivering an ingot of copper or aluminum to the London Metal Exchange. And you say, well, wait a minute, the system has to be reliable. And you say, okay, I don't know if it has to be, but the public demands it, and they will put people in office that make sure that happens. What's the mechanism by which that happens? Having the state-regulated utilities that have an obligation to serve and access to private capital make sure that the system runs. So the more intermittency we have on the merchant side, the more backup we're going to have, whether it's batteries, peaking gas plants, voltage control, all the things that make an electric grid work. Those dollars will be spent by the state-regulated utilities, and that's not a burden. It's actually a source of growth.
So let me ask you this. It seems like, as I understand your explanation of a cost plus utility, that there is an incentive there to spend more because you get to charge more. Yeah. Is that
Absolutely.
Is there a perverse incentive there?
Yeah, there is. And so it's called moral hazard. And so, no system was without its problems, right? There are these things called market failures in a free market. The free market works like 99% of the time, but it has these market failures. And this is one of them, where the public thinks of electricity as sort of a public good, sort of roads, literacy, national defense. Those are things that sort of everyone should be entitled to. And so that is why we have these. And so you set up these incentives, and people don't have the companies, since it's a cost plus model, they're being pressured by their public utility commissions, but there's no market competition for them to control costs. And so that's why, as an investor, we're the only investor in the utility space that advocates for what's known as performance-based rate making, meaning that, okay, if you have lower costs, high reliability, better safety statistics, and lower environmental emissions, and we're not just talking carbon here, we're talking mercury and nitrous oxide, and so the things that actually make people unhealthy in the immediate area, then you could get maybe not a 10% return, but maybe 12 or 13. And the company that does poorly on those doesn't get 0, but maybe they get 6 or 7. So the shareholders are now your mechanism by which the management of that enterprise is better. So you're introducing competition through measurable, these statistics on those. Emissions, safety, cost, and reliability have been measured to the 4th decimal point in this industry for the last 4 or 5 decades. So we know what those numbers are.
The data is available.
Yeah, why not just use that as a scoring mechanism? And of course, the industry associations are against it because they represent all people in the industry, the ones that would fall behind, as well as the ones that, well, I'm an investor and we're not an index investor. And so we know these companies. So we probably have a pretty good probability of picking who's going to be in the top end of that. So maybe you could say, well, that's self-interest for me advocating this. But I also believe that a system that needs to evolve, if it doesn't bend, it'll break. And so I think that's kind of where the system needs to go to address that moral hazard.
So there's a lot of states, I don't know, maybe definitely most states, I don't know if all states, have some form of a renewable portfolio standard, target where they say X amount of energy has to be from renewable sources.
Exactly.
How does that work into this whole discussion of the incentives and the need for utilities to shift to renewables and the cost that is associated with that?
So it's interesting. It's a great window into the historical dynamic here. If we go back 20 years, the only wind and solar that were being put in because the state had a requirement for it, because they were not below cost. And so we've been a big investor in Next Year Energy. That's the parent of Florida Power and Light. Next Year has 2 businesses: the Florida Power and Light, which is regulated utility mostly on the east coast of Florida. They come actually over here to the west coast on the south end in Naples, and they have a renewable development business. They are the largest renewable development company in the United States and probably the 2nd, 3rd largest in the world. And I asked them, I said, could you just on a timeline tell me, like, what portion of the wind and solar, say 20 years ago, and then 10 years ago, 5 years ago, was because of a mandate, and what portion is because it's actually now the cheapest? And so they put that in their investor deck, and they had these little pie charts that changed over time, and you could see it. It went from like 80% mandated to like 80% economic. Well, here we are now. They've had so much success, and they're being such a large part of production, electricity production, that you now have to say, wait a minute, you may be the low cost delivering electricity to that market node, but you're not low cost when I think about the equipment on the rest of the grid that has to be put in. And so if the utilities or the utility commission say, wait a minute, you guys are going too fast here. We need to put in, billions of dollars of backup generation. You may say, they may come back and say, well, we have a 30% or 40% renewable requirement. We're only at 25. We have to do this. So it actually, I think, could actually come back into the calculus because even though it's low cost, that's low cost when we draw a circle around that unit. When we draw a circle around the entire system, we have to add in the other costs.
When you say the other costs, I think you're referring to some of the transmission wires and the whole power grid.
But it's really backup power.
Backup power.
So Texas is a great window into this, right?
Yeah.
So Texas has two pieces of legislation that passed last year. Now, you got to remember, Texas is at the absolute opposite end of the political spectrum from California. The irony is they both have problems with their energy system. One is because it's too sort of, mandated by the government and they're sort of ignoring what economic incentives are. And the other is that, it's a great free market, but it ignores what the public wants, which is reliable energy. And the free market will provide that 99% of the time. But when you have something like hurricane, Winter Storm Uri, 100 people die, it's not good. So there was two pieces of legislation that finally made their way through the Texas legislature last year. And one of them, and the way they did this was fascinating, was it was a Senate bill. I can't remember the numbers, like 2627. And it was to fund a $10 billion fund to subsidize this dispatchable power, power that's available at turn of a switch. And so the legislature drafted the legislation. Public Utility Commission is going to oversee this. These are the rules. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. And the governor signed it, but it wasn't effective unless Proposition 7 passed. So it's sort of like, public, this is a free market state. I'm not going to do this. But if you want to do it, I'll draft it for you, but I'm giving you the final say so. And it passed 65-35. So the public overwhelmingly wanted it. I thought it was a fascinating political maneuver to get something the public wanted without being seen as an enemy to free markets. But the other bill that passed, which is fascinating, did not need a proposition to approve. It was called House Bill 1500. And for the first time since deregulation, House Bill 1500 requires, starting in January of 2027, that if you want access to the grid, this is what you were referring to before, we need to build out the grid to hook up more wind and solar, you have to be available like 90% of the time. In other words, you have a reliability requirement the same way as a regulated utility does. And so I've been on the phone talking to folks that know regulation and law. We had a conversation yesterday with this group called ARBO. They used to be called Law IQ. And I said, Gary, I'm not sure of the legislation, but what does federal legislation say about that requirement? He says, it can't happen. I said, well, how can they do it? They said, well, because Texas, most of Texas is not connected to the rest of the grid in the United States, and the federal government has no jurisdiction. And so here, what Texas has done is that they have put a regulation in an otherwise free market that says, if you want to sell your copper ingot to the London Metal Exchange, you've got to be there 90% of the time. And it's like, that's fascinating because even the federal government does not require that regulation, would not allow that regulation on anyone hooking up to the grid. It's a free market. If you can sell electrons for more than they cost, then you can deliver into that market. That's what a deregulated market is. Texas took a step towards regulating an otherwise free market. So it's fascinating that the public, because they demand reliability, you now have to tweak the rules of the market. And what I remind people of is that when we started deregulating electricity in the late 1970s, early 1980s, because of massive cost overruns from nuclear power plants and a drop in demand that came from the two oil shocks in 1973 in 1979, there was a run up in the wholesale price of electricity such that industries could make electricity on their own for less than they were being charged for it. I worked at Standard Oil of Ohio, BP, at that time, and I was running economics. We could make electricity for ourselves for 3 cents a kilowatt hour. The grid was charging us 6 because they had to, it was all cost recovery, right? Mm-hmm. And people realized, wait a minute, if industry starts leaving the grid, that means the fixed costs are going to be left holding. The people that don't have that scale are going to be stuck holding the bag. And so we had to start deregulating electricity. So, well, if you look at the wholesale price of electricity then versus today, adjusted for inflation, it's fallen by over 60%. So by that measure, deregulation was an overwhelming success. But like any market, if the public demands reliability or safety, whatever, they're going to have their elected officials come in, change the market rules, and they're going to tweak that otherwise free market. And the challenge is that you don't tweak it so much that you lose the efficiency, but you tweak it enough so that the public gets what they want. And if anyone thinks that challenge is easy, it's only because they have never worked this problem. And this is true in healthcare, education, no matter what any industry that the public has an interest in, you have this very difficult clashing of regulation and free market incentives.
I want to shift back to the more conventional energy because I have a few questions on that for you as well. We were earlier talking about the probability that you're going to continue to see demand growth, but we didn't get to talk much about supply and increasing production and whether or not that's actually happening. So I'm curious, as you look and analyze some of these companies, are they responding with that 7 or 8% increasing their expenses or their capex to pull more oil out of the ground and natural gas?
Yeah, when you look at what the industry is spending today, the answer is no. On average or in total, they're actually spending less than that amount. There is surplus capacity in the system, so that's why we haven't run out of oil. You're running down the surplus, and plus, when you look at Russia, because of problems that have been created for them because of the problems they're creating for other people, and Venezuela and Iran, you have sort of 3 countries whose production is up 1.5 million barrels a day in the last 3 years because the constraints on that capacity have, I don't want to say been removed. I don't think the Biden administration would say that, but Iran is producing a lot more oil now than they were 2 years ago. And so that's not new capacity. That's just sort of the reduction of a constraint. And that's happened in Venezuela too. And you are growing production in the Permian Basin, but the Permian Basin is one of the lowest cost areas in the world. So that's how commodity markets work, right? The person that has a profit is going to do it. In a commodity business, that's going to be the lowest cost producer. When you look outside of those areas, there's not a lot of growth, if any. And so when you look at in aggregate, the industry's not spending enough. You say, well, why did that happen? The answer is because the shareholders took the credit card away. Well, why did they do that? Well, because of the shale boom, these guys spent way too much money. That you do your best projects first and your worst projects last. So the more money you're spending, the lower your returns on capital, to the point when you look at the industry cycles, those last dollars have a 0 or negative return. Of course, the companies would object to that, but I'm looking at their financials and I can't explain it any other way. So the shareholders took the credit card away. And this was played out most visibly at Exxon a little over 3 years ago now. A little activist hedge fund called Engine Number One that owned a sum total of 0.03% of Exxon stock objected to. Exxon has 12 board members. They're staggered. So 3 years ago, they had 4 of the 12 coming up, and Engine Number One objected to them, and they won their slate on 3 of the 4, the directors. So this sent shockwaves throughout the industry. That was the most visible example of the shareholders taking the credit card away. The press represented what they did as sort of an environmental move, and there's actually a podcast. You can listen to the guy who runs. He says, no, this was basically corporate governance. This was, they were wasting shareholder capital, and I wanted that to stop. And think about it. Environmentalists don't own Exxon. They're leading a campaign to divest of Exxon. And if you don't own the shares, you can't vote. So the people that voted for those 3 directors aren't environmentalists. They're just investors trying to get their return. And so that cycle, which every industry has them, including this one, was a big cycle. And it was big because shale was such a huge phenomenon that attracted so much capital. And the other side of that cycle is spending too little, and that's kind of where you are now. And so when you look at the operating cash flow in the last 12 months of the industry, oil's average, call it $75 a barrel. That operating cash flow is up 42% from about 10 years ago. But because they've been buying back stock and paying down debt, their earnings per share in aggregate is up 322%. Same oil price, radically different return to the shareholders. And you say, well, but the world's going to run out of oil. It's like, well, it's going to run out of oil. But these companies that have outside investors who aren't putting up with wasted capital or returns anymore, that's, and I wrote a blog post, I think I put it on LinkedIn, that said, if you're looking for someone to blame for not enough oil, blame me. Blame me and all the other investors that said, look, you're given capital to get a return on it. And your return on capital employed in the industry pretty much went to zero. And, this is before the oil price collapsed. I mean, it went to zero when the average oil price was about $50 a barrel. You look at like a 5-6 year period before the pandemic, oil was $50 a barrel and their return on capital employed was practically zero. That's what shareholders objected to. That's why you've had the big cycle that you have. And that's why you've had this massive change in how the companies actually deploy their operating cash flow, special dividends, share buybacks, and pretty much the industry is going to get rid of most of their debt.
So does that side of the cycle last multi-years like the other side did, where you had this overinvestment is about the same?
Yeah, it lasts for a few years. You never know, right? I mean, in hindsight, everyone says, oh, yeah, you buy the stocks then. And it's like, well, you're looking at a chart. I mean, it's like when you're going through it, you don't know. But what matters is the factors that drive shareholder returns, right? Actual earnings and dividends, that you keep an eye on those factors. For the average investor, that's very difficult to do because the oil price goes up or down a few bucks every day, much less month to month, much less year to year. And so it's a very low signal noise ratio. But over time, people say, wait a minute, oil hasn't really run away. It's still, $60, $70, $80. And these guys are earning 2 or 3 times what they earned before so then now they ask the question. And now they're talking to their analysts, right? Because portfolio managers haven't talked to their oil analysts in 10 years, right? They talk to their tech analysts probably 3 times an hour. But the poor oil guy is sitting in his office waiting for the phone to ring. And only when those companies report earnings that are better over time for any given oil and gas price are people going to ask the question. And then that analyst will be basically giving an explanation of what I just gave. But if you're listening to this podcast, you just understand that's the dynamic. I mean, the last thing most portfolio managers are spending their time on these days is energy. It's on the Magnificent Seven, it's on interest rates. There's always these distractions. But over time, if the companies are earning the money, it shows up in their share price.
I mean, just looking at an index, if you look at the percentage of that earnings from the S&P 500 compared to the percentage of the market cap, it's much, much smaller in terms of size relative to the earnings contribution.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that was the other thing. When people looked at the market cap of the oil companies going down, and it got down to about 4% of the S&P 500 from 15 at its peak. And people said, see, this is renewables. This is clean energy. And it's like, no, it's not. It's their lack of earnings. The market is putting actually a higher PE on earnings that have basically disappeared. And it's like, well, why did the earnings disappear? Well, all the capital wasting that I just described. And so now it's the opposite, where their returns on capital employed have gotten back to where they need to be, which is what investors, and the market cap is still pretty low. And it's just so it's a low price earnings ratio. And there is still doubts that people have about the longevity of the business. So one thing you could argue is say, look, Jim, everyone knows what those companies are earnings. It's printed in the Wall Street Journal right after they're not willing to put a higher multiple because they believe in 10 years these companies are out of business. Well, we just had the discussion about oil and gas demand, and it's like, you can believe that if you want, but the arithmetic tells you just it's not the case. This is a massive system that will take decades to change.
So if you're an active manager and you're very selective in the sorts of companies that you invest in, and so you don't take the index approach when you're looking at energy companies, what are some of the characteristics that you are looking for when it comes to let's start off with a traditional energy company?
Yeah, so traditional energy companies. So all the research folks at EIP started their careers basically sort of in the industry,
right?
And so I was at Standard Oil of Ohio, majority owned by BP, for the first 8 years of my career. I had 7 different jobs. So this is it's kind of like being brought up in a poor neighborhood, right? So I was brought up sort of in the oil and gas, in refining and marketing business, low returns on capital. I wasn't born in the tech neighborhood or the healthcare neighborhood. I was born in the oil neighborhood. And when I became an investor, I did so because I knew that the returns were really in energy infrastructure, poles and wires, pipes and tanks. And that is where the steady returns are because they're natural and legal monopolies. They are cost plus businesses. And no, you won't have runaway returns on capital, but you won't have disasters either.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just collect and reinvest the dividends and pick the higher growing, better managed companies, you can massively outperform those indexes. The cyclical part of the business is something you do 2 or 3 times in a career. And I'm talking a 40, 50-year career. And now is one of those times. If you're a hedge fund, of course, you can short things. But if you're a long-only investor and you look at when you could have owned the cyclical part of the energy sector and better than the S&P, it's when it's being starved for capital. Because then, it's supportive for commodity prices, but also it's just the deployment of the cash flow is more shareholder friendly. And that is what the clean energy part of the world is suffering from. It's just the opposite. Supply is being subsidized by the government. So again, they're a commodity, but it's clean. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's clean or dirty. It's a commodity. Whether you make a fuel cell or a battery or a windmill or a solar farm, you are selling your service into a competitive market. It's not a regulated monopoly. And so it's competitive, it's cyclical, and it's being subsidized by government policy. Imagine we had government policy that was just a carbon tax. It would basically be providing incentives on the demand side, right? Because you say, wait a minute, if I use this energy source, I'll pay less tax than this. So it's going to affect, it would be, again, go back to the war on drugs, right? If you could tax addiction, I know it's a ridiculous concept, but imagine any kind of behavior, and this is why we have high taxes on alcohol, high taxes on tobacco, right? This is the sin taxes, right? And so that is society's view. If we want less of it, make it more expensive. That would be a demand side response, and you wouldn't be subsidizing fuel cells and batteries and wind and solar. You might have a different dynamic for investors. But when you look at that part of the clean energy world, you look at that part, the non-utility, non-renewable development part, those are the people that, that get the 25-year contracts. If you look at the fuel cell and those other guys, roughly half of the clean energy index, they are trading at 99 times forward earnings. And those forward earnings continue to decline. And so in 2023, analyst estimates for the year over the course of 2023 fell by over 70%. Estimates for 2024, the year we're in now, fell by over 40. What happened last year? The exact same thing. What happened the year before that? The exact same thing. So when people say these are high growth companies, they are high expected growth companies. The reality is that, in fact, they're competitive businesses, just like shale oil is a competitive business, just like automobiles is a competitive business. And so the conventional part of oil is doing better because it's being starved for capital. The clean part is doing worse because it's being subsidized with capital. So that's why a renewable developer is in a much better, because he's buying the windmill, he's buying the solar panel, he's not manufacturing it.
Interesting. You mentioned a carbon tax. Is that something that you would expect to actually be introduced at some point in the next several years, maybe after the election, or I guess it would maybe depend a bit on who wins, but
yeah, it's almost like the carbon tax is almost like nuclear fusion. It's always going to be an energy source of the future. What's fascinating about a carbon tax is no matter which political constituency you ask, they're for it.
Yeah.
So the market-oriented folks are for it because that's the most efficient way to address an externality. I mean, we had cap and trade in sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide, and it worked. Folks who are on sort of the left side of the aisle think that, it's just like tobacco and firearms. It's morally bad, and so you should tax it. And then you have trade protection people that say, yeah, we're importing goods from companies that are using coal to fire their power generation, and forget just the carbon they're spewing in the atmosphere. They're spewing mercury and sulfur dioxide and particulates and nitrous oxide and things like that. Just go to China, look at their air. Go to India, look at the air. And so why are we subsidizing those folks to send goods here? So the trade protection crowd wants it. So there's this group called the Global Climate Initiative that was started by George Shultz and James Baker, who both served in the Reagan administration. These are not exactly your tree-hugging, avocado toast-eating millennial environmentalists, right? These are dyed-in-the-wool conservative Republicans who want a market response to an externality. And they established their group probably 10 or 15 years ago. And it's remarkable how a policy that everybody is for doesn't seem to be able to get done. And there's a person I know who served a very senior level in the Bush administration. And I asked him about that. And he says, I understand everyone's for it. He says, here's the problem. As soon as you talk about a carbon tax, the whole thing degenerates into an argument. He says, his experience is that a more effective tool is simply a mandate. You talked about the renewable portfolio standards. It's like, you know what? This is the mandate. You free market, figure out how to get there. We're not going to tell you to get there. So just like a tax, it's a constraint that within which the free market optimizes. And so we got LED lights, not because we mandated LED lights, but because we put in 2007 in the Energy Security and Independence Act under Bush 43, we put in a 25% efficiency improvement for incandescent bulbs. There's only two ways you could accomplish that. Compact fluorescence, which everybody hates, and LEDs. So it was an LED legislation in basically except in name. And here we are. LEDs have dropped how much in price? And they use 12% of the same, 12% of the electricity. And so that's an example of how a mandate, and you mentioned can work maybe even better than a tax. And it works under the same mechanism. The free market is optimizing within that mandate. And so, but anyway, it's part of the argument and probably one of the reasons the carbon tax doesn't get passed. Europe has put in a border adjustment tax. It's not in place yet. And if they do that, I think it makes it easier. I cannot imagine us having a carbon tax without a border adjustment tax for imports where, you calculate the amount of carbon that went into that microwave oven or refrigerator, whatever it is you're importing.
Sure.
And that'll be added to the price, and that'll be the incentive for those countries to do something about their coal-fired power plants.
Another question I'm curious about, because I've seen, we're talking about traditional, conventional energy companies and renewable companies, and there's been a movement over the last several years for certain conventional energy companies to introduce their businesses where they say, well, we're going to also be renewable. We're going to be beyond petroleum.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
And
that's my alma mater.
So is that a good idea, or is that a bad idea?
I don't think it's a good idea for any company to do something that is not their core expertise. I think that's a statement of the obvious. They are under so much political pressure in Europe to do that. People, you may laugh at this analogy, but, at the turn of the 19th century, the streets of New York and Chicago were covered in manure because everybody drove a horse cart, right? And no one went to livery drivers for a solution to that problem and say, you need to invent an automobile.
Right.
Okay. So there's all kinds of technologies that could be cost competitive with research and adoption and deployment that have nothing to do with the expertise of the oil companies. Now, having said that, there are basic things that are cleaner energy that they have expertise. So what are the oil industry's expertise? Well, one is geology, right? They are some of the best geologists in the world. So when you talk about carbon capture and sequestration, which you're only going to do at a very large, cheap source, they know the geology. Well, how are you going to get the carbon dioxide to that spot? Through a pipeline. They're experts in that too. Well, what about capturing the carbon dioxide from an exhaust that has a lot of other things? Well, they're good at chemical engineering too. So geology, pipeline transportation, chemical engineering, and offshore construction. That is the four superpowers of the energy industry. And to the extent there is a business out there that's profitable, they bring that expertise, but they don't bring it to solar panels. They don't bring it to nuclear power. They don't bring it to running an electric grid. It's not their core. It's not their core competency.
I think that's a really good point, because there are, to your point, the areas where they have competitive advantages and expertise, that's a natural fit.
That's a successful company. It's all about the people, who manages them, do they have a skill that other people don't? Can you sell shirts for more than they cost?
Right.
I mean, let's keep this simple.
Yeah.
And so if you can sell your product for more than it costs because competition can't do it for the cost that you can, then you have a competitive advantage. And that's solely a function of the human beings and who you hire and retain and how you manage them and how they work together as a group.
Jim, there's so many more things we could talk about. The time has flown by. I think the carbon capture and sequestration, I think, could be a whole other podcast at some point. But I appreciate you coming on. My final question for you, when we were talking about this before the podcast started, one of the things that I think society would benefit from, certainly I would benefit more from, is expanding my reading list. So one of the things I always ask the guests to the ROI podcast is, do you have any book recommendations? Is there anything that you're currently reading or have recently read that you would recommend people check out?
So I read about 4 or 5 books at a time. So I'm going to give you the books I've finished.
Okay.
Because you never know if a book is good until you get all the way to the end.
That's
so
a good point.
So in the world of energy, I would recommend a couple of books. The one I've already mentioned is called Apocalypse Never, and it's written by Michael Schellenberger. Again, he's a 60s radical, and he gives you this really valuable history of sustainable investing that started really in the 1970s. And a lot of the people involved in the climate movement today got their start back then. So it's a great historical perspective on that movement, who's involved in their motivations. The other book is called Storms of My Grandchildren, and it's written by James Hansen. James Hansen, by any measure, is probably the best climate scientist on the planet. He was the head of the Goddard Space Institute in New York for 4 decades. And in spite of the fact that he's a scientist, he writes a book that's very easy to understand. And what he will explain to the reader is what is known about the climate and what is not known. Separating the greenhouse effect, which is not in dispute, with the feedback mechanisms that creates, some of which mitigate rise in temperature, some of which exacerbate it. And so he's not an alarmist. In fact, he was flushed out of the climate community because he did a number of studies with the insurance industry that said the current weather events, I'm going back 10 years, current weather events are actually within historical norms. Mm-hmm. Not that wouldn't change in the future, but there was no statistical evidence in the past, and they flushed him out of the system for saying that because it was heresy. He was simply trying to bring facts to the discussion. It's outside of energy. One of my favorite recent book was called The Idea Factory. It is about the history of Bell Labs. And so I participate in the energy environmental group at the Aspen Institute twice a year. I'm actually going next week. I met a gentleman there who he's a scientist, but he worked in the lighthouse. And one of his jobs going back 10, 15 years was to understand innovation in the United States. And he says, this is an oversimplification, but I studied it from one side to the other. And the answer is the Department of Defense and Bell Labs. And he says, so you've got to read this book. And the number of inventions that we enjoy today that came out of Bell Labs are absolutely jaw-dropping. The other book for folks that want to understand sort of the housing element of discrimination in this country, you have to read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It is the story of government policy towards housing segregation that began in World War II and then carried on from the federal to the states and the localities after that. It's a jaw-dropping book of what policies were coming out of the federal government in the 1940s when we had a housing crisis triggered by all the migration created by the war. The other two were about sort of the British Empire and colonialism in general. At the end of the day, we started off as a British colony. You could say we're Britain 2.0. And there is all of this debate now about colonialism and all of its harms. And so there's 2 books that you got to read. One was written quite a while ago, and it's called Heaven's Command by a person named Jan Morris. And it is the history of sort of the British Empire in the Victorian era and the tug and pull between sort of the moral instincts of the British people versus the commercial instincts of the British East India Company. Remember, it was the British that banned slavery. It was the British that dedicated as much as 15% of the Royal Navy to interdict slavery for no profit to themselves. The other one was just published by a gentleman by Nigel Beggar, who was actually a cleric. It's called Colonialism. And he goes through the history and the facts and the record of colonialism in general, but focuses a lot on the British Empire and the British East India Company and the mistakes that were made, the crimes that were committed, and what the British government did to punish those crimes. And he takes you through the history, but basically gets into a debate with the people that says this history is all bad. When he says, look, it's not all bad. Nothing's that simple. So it's a big debate today, and I recommend both of those books. One that was written before it became so political hot potato, and one that was just published last year in the middle of this heated debate. So if you're more interested in policy, those books. If you're more interested in energy, those other two books.
Love it. Well, that is plenty to consider. I always like to try to expand my my perspective. Yeah. So
I always get a new reading list every time I go to Aspen. So I'm going to come home next week with probably another 10 books I've got to read.
Yeah. So. Well, I appreciate it. We'll have to do this again at some point, Jim. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for the time.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks to all of you who have joined us on this episode of the First Trust ROI podcast. We'll see you next time.